The rain had been falling over Chicago for 6 straight hours when Daniel Reyes finally packed up his laptop and walked toward the elevator bank on the 31st floor of the Kessler Tower. It was past 11 on a Thursday night, the kind of hour when the building felt less like an office and more like a mausoleum, its glass corridors empty, its motion sensor lights flickering on one by one as he passed, then dying behind him like something following at a careful distance. He had told Marissa he'd be home by 9. That had been 2 hours and 40 minutes ago. There would be a text waiting for him, and it would not be gentle. But the Halloran account was due Monday morning, and Daniel had promised his director he would not be the reason the firm lost another client to Bregman and Cole, not after what had happened with the Ashford filing in the spring. So he had stayed. He had eaten a vending machine sandwich at 8 and washed it down with lukewarm coffee, and now his eyes ached and his shirt clung damply to his back, and all he wanted was his own bed and the sound of his wife's breathing beside him. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby, and there, behind the curved marble desk that always seemed too large for one man, sat Walter. Walter had been the night guard at Kessler Tower for as long as Daniel had worked there, a circumflex 4 years, maybe 5. He was somewhere north of 65, though he never gave his exact age, with a gray mustache gone slightly yellow at the edges from decades of cigarettes he swore he'd quit, and forearms that still looked like they belonged to a younger, harder man. He had been a Chicago police officer once, some said for over 20 years, though he rarely spoke of it, and when he did, it was only in fragments, a circumflex, a name, a street, a case that never closed. He wore his security uniform the way some men wear a uniform they miss more than they'll admit, pressed and buttoned to the throat even at midnight, even when there was no one left to see it but the cleaning crew and men like Daniel, stumbling out too late, smelling of stale coffee and fluorescent light. Tonight Walter was not doing his crossword. He was not leaning back in his chair with his radio murmuring low, the way Daniel usually found him. He was sitting very still, both hands flat on the desk, staring at the bank of small monitors built into the panel before him, a circumflex, the lobby cameras, the parking garage feed, the loading dock, the service corridor. His face, usually creased into an easy, weathered smile whenever Daniel came through, was doing something else entirely. It had gone the color of old paper. "Evening, Walter," Daniel said, shifting his bag on his shoulder, already moving toward the revolving doors and the rain beyond them. Walter didn't answer right away, and that, more than anything, was what made Daniel stop. "Mr. Reyes." Walter's voice came out low, almost private, as though he didn't want it carrying to the corners of the lobby, though there was no one else there to hear it. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel turned back, "Sure." Walter's eyes flicked toward the monitor bank, then back to Daniel, and there was something in that glance, a circumflex, a hesitation, a weighing, a circumflex that Daniel would think about for a long time afterward, long after that night had unraveled into something he could no longer explain to himself in daylight. "Is that your wife?" He said it plainly, without drama, the way a man asks for the time. But something underneath the plainness made the hair rise on the back of Daniel's neck. He came around the desk, following Walter's gaze to the third monitor from the left, the one that fed from camera 4, a circumflex, the parking garage, sublevel 2, the corner nearest the stairwell where the fluorescent tube had been flickering and dying for weeks despite 3 separate maintenance requests. The image was grainy, black and white, time-stamped in the corner, 11:04 p.m. A woman stood beside a dark sedan. She wore a long coat, pale, the collar turned up against a cold that didn't belong to a parking garage. Her hair was down, dark, falling just past her shoulders. She was not moving. She stood with her back half-turned to the camera, facing someone Daniel could not see, a circumflex, someone standing in the blind angle beyond the concrete pillar, cut off entirely from the frame. Daniel's stomach did something strange, a slow drop, like a floor giving way one board at a time. Marissa had a coat like that, pale wool, knee-length, a Christmas gift from her sister 2 years back. She wore it on the coldest days, complaining that Chicago winters made a joke of anything less. And her hair a circumflex, she'd worn it just like that lately, since she'd stopped straightening it, since she'd started saying she wanted to feel more like herself again, whatever that meant, whatever had prompted her to say it in the first place. That's not possible, Daniel said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure what he meant by them. A circumflex, not possible that it was her, or not possible that it wasn't. My wife's at home. She's a circumflex, she's been home all night. I talked to her at 8. I'm not saying it's her, Walter said carefully. I'm asking, because I've been sitting here 20 minutes now and she hasn't moved. Not once. Not a step, not a shift of weight. 20 minutes, Mr. Reyes, and she's standing there like she's carved out of the same concrete as that pillar. Daniel leaned closer to the monitor, close enough that his breath fogged faintly against the plastic housing. The image blurred and sharpened as his eyes adjusted, hunting for some detail that would break the resemblance apart, some feature that would let him laugh this off, get in his car, and drive home to the woman who was surely there, in their kitchen, texting him something sharp about the time. But the longer he looked, the more the coat seemed to be that coat, the more the fall of the hair seemed to be her hair, the more the tilt of that unmoving head, a circumflex chin very slightly lowered, as though listening to something being said just beyond the camera's mercy. A circumflex seemed to be a gesture he had watched 1,000 times across 1,000 dinner tables. Can you zoom in? Daniel asked, and his own voice sounded strange to him, too tight, climbing half an octave higher than he meant it to. Walter's hands moved over the panel, quick and practiced despite his age, the movements of a man who had spent a career learning to be calm when everyone around him wasn't. The image on camera 4 enlarged, the grain thickening, the woman's face resolving into something both more and less certain. A circumflex, more detail, less clarity, the way a word repeated too many times stops sounding like a word at all. It was her face, or it was almost her face. There was a slight wrongness to it that Daniel couldn't name, something in the angle of the jaw, or perhaps only the poor lighting distorting what his own eyes wanted to see, twisting a stranger into his wife because his wife was the shape his mind reached for first in any dark room. You said she hasn't moved, Daniel said, for 20 minutes. Not an inch. Walter's jaw worked, and Daniel realized with a small shock that the old man was frightened. In 4 years, Daniel had seen Walter unbothered by drunks pounding on the glass at 2 a.m., unbothered by a fire alarm malfunction that had half the building's tenants convinced the place was burning down, unbothered once by a man who had walked into the lobby with what turned out to be a very real knife tucked into his coat sleeve. Walter did not get frightened. Walter got calm, in the particular, terrible way that men who have seen real trouble get calm. There's someone else there, Daniel said, behind the pillar. There is. Walter's finger tapped the edge of the monitor, indicating a shadow at the frame's border, a suggestion of shoulder, of arm, nothing more. Whoever it is, they've been standing there the whole time too, not talking that I can tell, not moving, just a circumflex standing, watching her maybe, or she's watching them, I can't tell which way it runs. Daniel felt the beginning of something cold uncoil in his chest, something that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with animal instinct, the oldest part of the brain recognizing danger before the newer parts could construct a sentence to explain it. I need to call her, he said, already reaching for his phone. Do that, Walter said. I'll keep watching. Daniel dialed. It rang. Once, twice, 3 times, the second stretching unbearably as the muted footage on the screen continued to show that unmoving pale shape in the dark. 4 rings. 5. Then, hey, you. Marissa's voice, warm, slightly muffled, the sound of the television faint behind her. Please tell me you're finally leaving. I made you a plate, it's probably stone cold by now, but the thought was there. Relief crashed through Daniel so hard his knees nearly buckled against the security desk. Yeah, I'm leaving right now. Just a circumflex, where are you? In the apartment. Where else would I be? It's 11 at night. A pause and then sharper, the instinct of a wife who has learned to read the register of her husband's voice across 15 years of marriage. Daniel, what's wrong? Nothing. He looked at the monitor. The woman in the pale coat had not moved. Nothing's wrong. I'll explain when I get home. I love you. He hung up before she could press further, because he did not yet have words for what he needed to explain, and because some deep, superstitious part of him did not want to say it aloud. A circumflex did not want to give it shape by speaking it a circumflex until he understood what it was. She's home, he told Walter. She's been home all night. Walter did not look relieved. If anything, his expression tightened further, the lines around his mouth deepening. Then who in God's name is that? They both looked back at the screen, and in that instant a circumflex. Daniel would swear to this later, though he could never quite prove it to himself in the retelling a circumflex. The woman in the pale coat turned her head very slowly and looked directly into the camera. Not at the pillar, not at the shape beside her. Into the lens, as though she had known all along that she was being watched and had simply been waiting for the correct moment to acknowledge it. Then the feed cut to static. "Camera's out," Walter said immediately, his hands already moving across the panel, cycling the input, restarting the connection. "Happens sometimes, that line's old. I've flagged it twice with Facility ESA." But his voice had lost its calm. Daniel could hear it fraying at the edges, the professional detachment cracking to reveal the same animal alarm that was climbing through his own chest. "Bring up the other cameras on that level," Daniel said. "The stairwell, the exit ramp, anything." Walter cycled through the feeds. Sublevel 2 showed empty rows of parked cars, rain-streaked concrete, nothing moving but a stray plastic bag tumbling in some draft from the exit vents. The stairwell camera showed only the stairwell, gray and lit and utterly empty. The exit ramp showed the barrier arm, motionless, the rain falling steadily beyond it into the street. "There," Daniel said, and his own voice sounded very far away to him. "Bring that one back up, camera 4. Walter tried. The feed remained a wall of gray static, patient and total, as though the camera itself had simply decided it would show them nothing further tonight. "I'm going down there," Daniel said. "Mr. Reyesa. I need to see. I need to know if there's a circumflex, if someone's down there, if someone got hurt." He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't know how it ended. He only knew that the thought of driving home and lying in bed beside his wife with this unresolved, this woman's face folded somewhere in the dark of the parking garage 2 floors beneath him, was unbearable in a way he could not have explained to anyone who had not seen what he had just seen. Walter stood, more slowly than a younger man might have, but with a settled deliberateness that told Daniel the old cop was still in there somewhere, underneath the security guard's blazer. "Not alone, you're not. Give me 30 seconds." He disappeared into the small office behind the desk and came back with a flashlight, heavier than it needed to be, the kind that could double as a weapon in a pinch. And Daniel understood with a jolt that Walter had chosen it for exactly that reason. They went down together, a circumflex, not the elevator, which felt too slow, too enclosed, but the stairwell, their footsteps echoing off the bare concrete walls in a rhythm that seemed, absurdly, to grow louder the lower they went, as though the building itself were amplifying their approach for an audience already waiting below. The door to sublevel 2 opened onto a wash of sour fluorescent light, half the tubes along the far wall dead or dying, exactly as camera 4 had shown. The air was colder here than it had any right to be, tinged with exhaust and standing water and something else beneath it, something Daniel could not name, but that made the fine hairs on his arms rise regardless. "There," Walter said quietly, and his flashlight beam swept across the row of cars toward the corner by the stairwell, toward the dark sedan they had seen on the monitor. The sedan was there. The space beside it where the woman had stood was empty. Daniel walked forward before he had decided to, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the enclosed concrete space, his eyes scanning the shadows between the pillars for any sign of movement, any sign that the woman in the pale coat had been real at all, and not some trick of failing electronics, and a mind primed by exhaustion to see his wife's face everywhere. "Careful," Walter said, close behind him, his flashlight beam sweeping the corners methodically, the disciplined arc of a man who had cleared rooms before, who knew that a corner unchecked was a corner that could hurt you. They reached the sedan. Up close, it was an ordinary car, dark blue, a Midwestern winter's worth of road salt dried pale along its lower panels. Nothing about it that spoke of anything but an anonymous commuter vehicle belonging to some tenant or visitor of the building. Its windows were fogged from the inside, which struck Daniel as wrong before he understood why acircumflex fogged windows meant heat inside a cold car, meant, perhaps, that someone had recently been sitting in it with the engine running, breathing, warm, alive. Walter tried the door, locked. "Anything on the ground?" Daniel asked, and Walter swept the flashlight beam low, across the oil-stained concrete, and their acircumflex just at the edge of the beam's reach, tucked half beneath the sedan's rear tire acircumflex, was a single earring. Small, gold, a thin hoop with a tiny pearl drop, the kind Marissa wore nearly every day. The kind Daniel had bought her for their 10th anniversary from a jeweler on Michigan Avenue because she had once mentioned, in passing, years before, that she'd always wanted pearls but never owned any. Daniel's hand was shaking when he picked it up. "That yours? Your wife's, I mean?" Walter asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer, had perhaps suspected it since the moment they'd stepped off the elevator, and had only been waiting for confirmation to let the fear show fully on his face. "It's hers," Daniel said. "Or acircumflex, it's like hers. It could be a coincidence. They sell things like this everywhere. There's no way Toa." "Mr. Reyes." Walter's voice had gone very quiet, the way a man's voice goes quiet when he is trying very hard not to alarm someone who is already close to the edge. "I think we should go back upstairs. I think we should call this in properly, and I think you should call your wife again." Daniel called. It rang once, twice. On the third ring it connected, but there was no voice on the other end acircumflex, only a long, staticky silence, broken by what might have been breathing, or might have been the wind moving through a badly sealed window, or might have been nothing at all, only Daniel's own fear supplying sound where there was none. "Marissa," his voice cracked on the second syllable. "Marissa, are you there?" The silence stretched. Then, faintly distorted, a voice that was and was not his wife's voice said, "Daniel," just his name, nothing more, and the call dropped. He tried again immediately. This time it went straight to voicemail, her recorded voice acircumflex, warm, familiar, utterly herself acircumflex, asking him to leave a message. And the ordinariness of it, set against what he had just heard, against the pale coat on the monitor and the earring cold in his palm, was almost worse than silence would have been. "We need to go," Daniel said. "I need to get home." "I'll drive you," Walter said, already moving toward the stairwell. "You're in no state, and if something's wrong at that apartment, you don't want to be the only one walking into it." The drive across the city took 11 minutes that felt like 11 hours, the rain sheeting hard enough now that the wipers on Walter's old sedan struggled to keep pace, the streetlights smearing past in long yellow trails. Daniel called Marissa 4 more times. Twice it rang out. Once it connected and dropped after a single second of static. The fourth time, it didn't ring at all, acircumflex, a dead line, a number, Daniel thought with rising panic, that no longer seemed to exist. Walter didn't speak much during the drive, but once, at a red light on Ashland Avenue, he said, without turning his head, 22 years on the force. You learn things stay quiet right before they get loud. This has that feeling. I want you to know that so you're not surprised by whatever we find." "What do you think we're going to find?" Daniel asked, and his voice came out smaller than he intended. Walter didn't answer for a long moment. "I think," he said finally, "that somebody's been planning something for a while, and tonight's the night they decided to stop planning." They reached the apartment building at 11:47. The lobby was quiet, the night doorman half asleep behind his own desk, and Daniel didn't wait for the elevator a circumflex. He took the stairs two at a time, Walter following with more effort but no less urgency, up to the fourth floor, down the carpeted hallway to apartment 4C, where a thin line of light showed beneath the door, and the television, faintly, could be heard murmuring some late-night program to an audience of no one. Daniel's key trembled in the lock. He got the door open and called her name, and for one terrible, suspended second there was no answer at all, only the television's blue light flickering against the living room wall, throwing long shadows that seemed, in that first instant, to have shapes he didn't recognize. Then Marissa came around the kitchen doorway, wrapped in her robe, hair pulled back, an actual plate of actual reheated dinner in her actual hands, and said, "Finally. I was starting to think you'd a-circumflex Daniel. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." He crossed the room and held her before either of them said another word, held her tightly enough that she made a small, surprised sound against his shoulder, and over her head he looked at Walter, standing uncertainly in the doorway, and saw his own confusion mirrored there. "You're okay," Daniel said, more to himself than to her. "You're really okay." "Of course I'm okay. I've been home all night. What is going on?" She pulled back to look at his face, and whatever she saw there made her set the plate down on the counter and take his hands in both of hers. "You're freezing, and you're shaking. Daniel, please tell me what happened." He told her a-circumflex haltingly, the words tumbling out of order, the pale coat, the 20 motionless minutes, the face turning to the camera, the earring beneath the tire, the strange dead-air phone call in which he'd heard, or thought he'd heard, her voice say his name from somewhere that was not this apartment. As he spoke, something in Marissa's face changed. Not disbelief a-circumflex, something worse, recognition. She was quiet for a long moment after he finished. Then she walked slowly to the small jewelry dish on the entry table and lifted a single gold hoop earring with a tiny pearl drop, its match sitting untouched beside it. "I lost the other one 3 weeks ago," she said quietly. "I thought it fell down the drain in the bathroom. I never told you because I didn't think it mattered." The room seemed to tilt, very slightly, around Daniel. "There's something else," Marissa said, and her voice had dropped, gone careful in a way he had rarely heard from her. "My sister, Alina. You know we look alike a-circumflex. Everyone's always said so since we were kids. People used to mix us up at family things." She swallowed. "She's been staying in the city the past 2 weeks. She didn't want me to tell you yet. She's a-circumflex. She's leaving her husband, Daniel, Robert. And she made me promise not to say anything, because she was scared of what he might do if he found out she'd told anyone, even you, even family. She's been staying at a friend's place near your office, actually, only 4 blocks from Kessler Tower. I lent her my coat because she left most of her things behind when she went. She has pearl earrings almost exactly like these. Mom gave us a nearly identical pair for our birthdays years apart. She probably doesn't even remember I have the twin of hers." Walter, still standing in the doorway, said slowly, "And this Robert, would he know what car your sister's using? Would he know where to look for her?" Marissa's face went pale. "He's a controlling man. He always has been." Alina said. She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "She said 2 days ago that she thought he'd followed her once, that she thought he knew more than he was letting on." Daniel's phone buzzed in his hand. A text from a number he didn't recognize, 6 words long. "Tell your wife I found her." The three of them stood very still in the lamplit apartment, the television still murmuring its indifferent late-night noise, the rain still falling steadily against the windows. And for a moment nobody moved at all, as though movement itself might summon whatever was coming closer. Then Marissa's phone rang. It was Alina's number. She answered with a shaking hand, put it on speaker, and a voice a circumflex breathless, frightened, unmistakably her sister's a circumflex said, "Marissa, I think he's outside. I think he's outside the building right now. I saw the car. I need you to call someone. I need a." And then the line went to that same terrible static Daniel had heard on his own call an hour before, and cut out entirely. Walter was already moving, pulling his radio from his belt, calling something in low, clipped, practiced tones that Daniel only half registered through the roaring in his own ears. An address Marissa gave in a voice gone thin with panic. A description of a man neither Daniel nor Walter had ever seen. A plea for someone, anyone, to get there before whatever had already begun in some other apartment across the city reached its ending. "We have to go," Marissa said, already pulling on shoes, her hands trembling so badly she could barely manage the laces. "Daniel, we have to go now. She's alone," she said. "I'll drive," Walter said, and there was something in the old man's voice now, some old authority surfacing after decades of retirement, some version of himself that had walked into rooms like this before and knew exactly what needed to happen in the next 10 minutes. "I called it in. There's a squad car 4 minutes out. We can beat them there if the lights cooperate." They ran. Down the stairs, into the rain, into Walter's old sedan, and the drive across the city a second time was faster and wilder than the first, red lights treated as suggestions, the wipers slapping uselessly against a downpour that seemed, in Daniel's frayed and frightened perception, to be trying to slow them down on purpose. Alina's building was a narrow brownstone on a quiet residential street, the kind of block where nothing ever happened, where porch lights burned steadily and no one locked their gates. Tonight, though, a car was parked crookedly across 2 spaces near the entrance, its driver's door hanging open, its headlights still on, throwing long cones of rain-streaked light across the wet pavement. Marissa was out of the car before Walter had fully stopped it, running toward the building's entrance, screaming her sister's name into the night, and Daniel followed, his heart slamming against his ribs, Walter close behind with his heavy flashlight gripped now like the weapon he'd chosen it to be. The building's front door stood ajar. Inside, the stairwell light flickered, the same failing fluorescent hum that had greeted them in the parking garage hours before, as though the whole city had conspired tonight to dim itself at exactly the wrong moments. They found Alina on the second-floor landing, sitting with her back against the wall, one hand pressed to a shallow cut above her eyebrow, her whole body shaking, but alive a circumflex unmistakably, miraculously alive. A few feet away, a man lay groaning on the floor, his hand cradled awkwardly against his chest, a heavy ceramic vase shattered beside him. "He grabbed me," Alina managed, as Marissa dropped to her knees beside her, wrapping her in an embrace so fierce it seemed to hold both sisters upright at once. "He grabbed my arm in the hallway and I hit him with the vase from the side table. I didn't even think. I just circumflex, I just swung." Robert did not get up. Whether from the blow or from the sudden, sirening arrival of the squad car Walter had called in, screeching to a halt outside just as Daniel reached the landing, he remained where he was, cursing under his breath, until 2 uniformed officers came up the stairs and took the matter, finally, out of the hands of an accountant, a retired cop turned security guard, and 2 terrified sisters. It was nearly 2 in the morning before the questions were finished, before statements were taken, before Alina was seen briefly by paramedics and pronounced shaken, but unhurt beyond the small cut, before Robert was let out in handcuffs, still protesting, still insisting through gritted teeth that none of this was what it looked like, that Alina had misunderstood, that he only wanted to talk. Daniel and Marissa sat afterward on the brownstone's front steps, the rain finally thinning to a fine, cold mist, Alina wrapped in a blanket beside them, and Walter leaning against his car a few feet away, quietly finishing a cigarette he'd sworn off years before, and clearly did not care tonight to apologize for. The woman on the camera, Daniel said slowly, piecing it together aloud as much for himself as for anyone listening. "That was Alina. She must have come to find you to talk, and stopped near your building A circumflex, no, near mine, near Kessler Tower, because that's where her friend's apartment is. And Robert had followed her there. That's who was standing behind the pillar. He must have confronted her right there in the garage before she managed to get away and go home." "She never told me she'd come that close," Marissa said quietly, staring at her sister, who had gone pale and silent beside her, cradling a cup of coffee somebody's neighbor had brought out to the stoop. "She never told me he'd already found her once tonight." "I didn't want you to worry," Elena said softly. "I thought I'd lost him. I thought I was safe. I didn't know he'd followed me all the way home." Walter dropped the cigarette and ground it out beneath his heel, and when he spoke, his voice had returned to something like its usual gravel, though gentler now, worn thin by the night's long adrenaline. 22 years on the job," he said, "and you'd think nothing surprises you anymore. But it's never the thing you expect. It's never the obvious danger walking straight at you. It's always some quiet detail sitting sideways in the corner of a screen, something that doesn't look like anything until you look at it long enough." He glanced at Daniel. "Good thing you didn't just walk on by tonight, Mr. Reyes. Good thing you stopped to look." Daniel thought of the pale coat standing motionless in that grainy frame, of the single earring cold in his palm, of the 11 minutes crossing the city not knowing whether he was racing toward his wife or toward the end of everything he understood about his own life. He thought, too, of how close the whole night had come to slipping past unnoticed a circumflex, how easily he might have simply walked to his car in the rain, distracted, exhausted, and driven home to an ordinary evening, never knowing that 4 blocks away, in a stranger's stairwell that was not a stranger's at all, someone's sister had been fighting for her life in the dark. "I almost didn't stop," he admitted. "If you hadn't said something, Walter, I would have just gone home." "That's the job," Walter said simply, looking up at the brownstone's window where a light had gone on in a neighbor's apartment, someone drawn by the sirens, peering down at the small, damp, exhausted cluster of people gathered on the steps below. "Noticing what everyone else walks past. Most nights it's nothing. Just a woman waiting for a ride, a shadow that's only a shadow." He allowed himself at last something close to a smile, tired and thin, but real. "Then there's nights like tonight, where you're glad you asked the question anyway." The mist kept falling, softer now, more silver than gray under the streetlights, and somewhere far off a second siren wailed briefly and faded. Some other emergency. Some other night's small catastrophe unfolding in a city that never entirely slept. Marissa reached over and took Daniel's hand, and Alina leaned her head against her sister's shoulder, and for a while none of them said anything more, content simply to sit together on the wet stone steps, breathing, alive, while the last of the night's danger was driven away in the back of a patrol car, and the ordinary world slowly, uncertainly, began to settle itself back into place around them. It was almost dawn by the time Daniel and Marissa finally climbed the stairs to their own apartment again, the sky over the lake beginning to pale at its eastern edge, gulls calling somewhere in the wet, brightening air. Daniel paused at the window before he undressed for bed, looking out at the wakening city, the taxis beginning their morning circuits, the first commuters hunched beneath umbrellas at the corner stop. He thought of Walter, driving home now himself, probably, to whatever quiet apartment or house held whatever remained of his own life after the job that had shaped him a circumflex, a man who had spent decades learning to see the wrongness hidden in ordinary frames, who had noticed, on an unremarkable Thursday night, a stillness in a woman's shoulders that everyone else would have scrolled past without a second glance. "Is that your wife?" he had asked. Such a simple question, and yet it had unraveled, thread by thread, into the truth of everything that had been quietly, dangerously happening just beyond the edges of what Daniel had thought he knew about his own life, his own family, the ordinary Thursday he had believed himself to be living. He climbed into bed beside Marissa, who was already half asleep, her hand finding his beneath the blanket without needing to open her eyes. "You should get security cameras that work," she murmured, drowsy, almost smiling. "I should listen to security guards who tell me to look twice," Daniel answered, and outside their window the city went on waking, indifferent and enormous, holding within it, as it always had, 1,000 small, quiet dangers that most people would never notice at all a circumflex unless, on some particular night, for some particular reason, somebody finally stopped long enough to ask the right question, and somebody else was brave enough to answer it honestly.